The book is by Mark Curtis. It's Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam. And we both decided it was a really important book to read because we've seen a pattern before in the history of the last 2 or even 3 centuries, in which something interesting happens between the dominant power of that era, which is unquestionably the British Empire, and some strains of Islam. I mean, I've seen it in books about the British Raj in India. We saw it when we talked about the Crimean War, where viewers who know that episode will recall many people in Britain became pro-Islamic and anti-Orthodox because they saw Islam as, quote, Unitarian, and Orthodox Christianity as practiced in Russia as obscurantist, sort of more papist than the papists, and to be abhorred. And so, as Mark Curtis says in this book, this idea that Britain is anti-Islamic, which a lot of people hold now, is just wrong. It's historically wrong. The pattern is much more complicated, and it includes some episodes of really deep and scary collusion with some pretty grim Islamist groups. The problem is the British Empire was not only the dominant power of the past few centuries, it's also by far the best at managing its public relations. So that because these collusions are not something British custodians of their history want to tell you about, you won't hear much about it most of the time. In fact, in Curtis's book, he, and he is English as far as I know, yes, says testily every few pages, of course you won't hear about this, or even you'll hear about the CIA doing this, but not about MI6. Mm-hmm. And he's implicitly complimenting those custodians for the skill with which they've hidden all this history.
Yeah, that's one of the things I got from this book. It's both kind of, it's sickening, this double game they play, and, you know, impressive. There's just no other word to give it. And especially as Britain gets weaker and weaker, they never stray from their absolutely like Hitlerian imperial strategy. You know, they get less overtly racist about it, I guess, in more modern times. But they never get shameful. They never have strayed from, you know, what their goal is, which is to run as much empire as they can and to maintain as much global power as they can, and by any means necessary. It's kind of amazing to behold this and so you get an insight into this in this book from their evolving relationship with their crumbling empire and then their increasingly close relationship with radical Islam.
At its simplest, this means the creation of the 2 states that are at the heart of what we're calling Islamism: Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. I mean, Saudi Arabia is very much involved with British collusion. I mean, the Americans took over later, but in the early stages, it was the British who were calling the shots. And Pakistan is an outright creation of the British Empire. I mean, that's the more obvious case. The idea of a Pakistan is very, very recent. There's always been some state in the Najd in central Saudi Arabia, but Pakistan, they made that one up.
Yep. Yeah, that's pretty shocking. I mean, they divide and rule. They saw that they could have some leverage, a nuisance value against the majority Hindu nationalists by turning the Muslims within the Raj, the larger India, greater India, as it was, against them, and then creating a whole fiction, essentially, through textbooks and through empowering local proxies, creating this idea of Pakistan in their head and pushing it on certain select, proxies. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and it was well done, and it was carefully done and cold-bloodedly done. I've actually heard this in memoirs from people who grew up in families of what used to be the ruling class of the empire. When they see Americans crying on the news in Vietnam, I remember one talking about his mother watching this and saying, "They're always so emotional." The empire, I mean, when the stereotype of stiff upper lip doesn't apply at all to any British people you actually know at the moment. They're pretty voluble people, but for the class that ruled the empire, there was a certain strategic cold-bloodedness that I don't think America has ever matched, and this is reflected in how hard it is to find information about this. Just to do a brief digression, an example of the kind of difficulty you have in finding this stuff out. Because basically, look, if you're a German intellectual, you spend all your time talking about how horrible German people are and how horrible Germany is. If you're a French intellectual, you have complete scorn for French nationalism and the idea of the French and all their pretensions to being the incarnation of civilization. If you're an American, you're either a wacko right-winger or a wacko left-winger. One way or the other, you embrace American exceptionalism like, oh, we're the root of all evil, or, oh, we can do no wrong. But if you're a British intellectual, it's really tricky. There's a kind of very sophisticated discretion about these embarrassing moments. And that's why it's hard to find these things. So I've started finding them in weird little places. Like, here's an example. Travel book about the Middle East in the 1930s by Robert Byron. It's called The Road to Oxiana. It's not about geopolitics at all. He's an aesthete, basically. He's interested in architecture more than anything. But one of his diary entries is this. The mailbag has come up this fortnight from Baghdad in charge of an Air Force officer who helped evacuate the Assyrians. He said that if he and his fellow officers had been ordered to bomb the Assyrians, as was mooted, they would have resigned their commissions. The aerodrome where they landed near Mosul was strewn with bodies, mostly shot in the genitals. They, the British, had to bury them. From the windward of the village came a frightful stench, which reminded the older officers of the Great War. They took photographs of the bodies, but these were confiscated on return to Baghdad, and orders were given that nothing was to be said of what they had seen. He was furiously indignant, as anyone might be when it comes to saving British face by the concealment of atrocities. Now that came out of nowhere in this travel book. And I thought, what? Why would the British be concealing a massacre of Assyrians? I mean, this is not a self-flagellating culture. This is not like, oh, what did we do to the Assyrians? And it's very hard to find out about this. This turns out to be something called the Simele Massacre of 1933, in which the British, who had used the Assyrians as colonial auxiliary troops, made a new deal with their Iraqi puppet government and just dropped the Assyrians off. And that meant the Assyrians were now cut loose, the hated lackeys of the foreign oppressor, and also a minority religion, a minority ethnic group, minority everything. So they were terrified. The neighborhood is full of people who are bigger and stronger than they are. Not all Arabs. There are some Arab tribes. There are also Kurds. There are also Turkmen. And all those people are going to pounce on them. So the Assyrians make an attempt to defend themselves. That's initially successful, and then it fails. And then they're massacred. 60 villages are destroyed. And what happens to the people, we don't know. Don't need to go into the gory details, but it's pretty horrible. They're not just killed, because that's not how it happens in this kind of war. They're killed in ways that everybody's supposed to remember, and not quickly. So the British decide that their real interest here is not with the Assyrians. They like the Assyrians. They used to work with them. But this is business. So they decide their real interest is the Iraqi government. They hush up the massacre. That's why those photos were confiscated in that quick little aside in that travel book. But they hush it up so well that you will never hear about it. I mean, I read a lot of this stuff, and I never heard about it. You hear about the Turkish massacre of Assyrians, but not this massacre. And apparently there was even some talk about interceding on the Iraqi side when it looked like the Assyrians might be able to hold out for a while. That's why he's talking about the possibility of airstrikes by British aircraft that the pilots were so outraged about. Because and then not only was it business as usual at the time, but afterwards. It was hushed up not just at the time, but forever. And this is the kind of history that Mark Curtis is very bravely trying to recover in his book. And in general, he does a pretty good job. He's especially good, I think we both agreed, in talking about the formation of Saudi Arabia, which is the thing he covers first. I don't know, you want to talk about that?
I mean, yeah, he's good. I think he's good in a few things. He's good about talking better in talking about the formation of Saudi Arabia, I think, than Pakistan. But he's also good at keeping his eye on the ball, as they say in the sports world, in terms of what are sort of the ongoing common politics, throughout, let's say, a century plus. And what it is that, first of all, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf sheikdoms, we know that they provide, far more support for reactionary right-wing Islamic fundamentalist, militias and terrorist groups, as for lack of a better word, we'll just use terrorist groups, than, say, Iran or Syria. And we also know that both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are creations of Britain, and these two things, again, it's the obvious thing. These things are obvious, but it's never really been put together much, right. Or very little has it been put together, and he keeps reminding of the politics of this, that far-right Islamic fundamentalism is used to crush secular Arab politics. Why is there no secular, or why is there very little secular Arab nationalist or secular left-wing Arab politics today? And what's left is very, very degraded, and it's because there's been a very active and concerted effort by, and it's if it were a different part of the world, if it were in Europe, maybe we would support more progressive politics parts. It's just the reality of how Britain and then America coming up and the oil companies behind them have decided this is the best way we can secure our wealth, is through this kind of politics. And I also like, the book seems a bit rushed and hurried, and that was the one frustrating thing about it. It could have been organized a bit better at times, I think. So he gives early on 5 ways that Britain, and by extension we could say America, have used radical Islamists to, for their own power, for our power and our empire. 1 is a counterforce to secular nationalism and leftism. 2, conservative muscle domestically to counter secular nationalists and leftists within pro-West reactionary regimes. 3 is shock troops to destabilize or overthrow unfriendly governments. And, this is also where having relationships with certain far-right shock troops in other countries like Ukraine also is useful. You can use them to destabilize or overthrow unfriendly governments. Another, as proxy militias to fight wars. This is the one that really stands out. You really see this come to the fore in a big way in Afghanistan, and then it becomes a kind of repeated strategy throughout the Middle East since then. And also as political tools for leverage against governments or in wars. And so this is the explanation, because one of the things he wants to get at also is why, quote unquote, London stand. In other words, why have they tolerated so many Islamists, these reactionary fundamentalist imams?
For example, Abu Hamza, who is
right.
not a big name in the U.S., but I think is a big name in Britain.
Yes.
Very notorious. Jihadi preacher, also known as Hook Hand, because he lost a lot of body parts in Afghanistan. Completely wild jihadi preacher. could not be arrested
Yes.
for many, many years. And people in Britain didn't understand that.
Yeah.
And Curtis pretty well implies there's a reason for that.
Yeah, there's a reason. It gives you leverage. It also, they think it's the informant thing. He's also like flypaper, attracting, other radical idiots that you can watch. He might be a double agent or an informant. What they don't do is shut them down, though. What they don't do is stomp on them, and that's because they're more useful, empowered than disempowered, and that's the horrible side of this story. One of the things, before we even talk about the Saudis, though, unfortunately he does this in a kind of chopped up chronological order, but he really has some shocking and important quotes early on, even going back to when the Brits who ruled the Raj, which is larger India, which is now divided up into a few states. Some of the things that they were saying after the mutiny in 1857, how they did need to stoke and inflame communalism and divide in order to rule the place. And John, if you don't mind, I just want to read a couple quotes. This is right from the horse's mouth, because he went in and got some declassified, Mark Curtis, who wrote this book, went in and looked at primary source documents and papers and materials. And he quotes some of these. So here's one thing from the late 1800s, a British, he was the Secretary of State in India, George Francis Hamilton, and he wrote to Lord Curzon, who was the viceroy. He advised that he should, quote, should so plan the educational textbooks in Greater India that the differences between community and community are further strengthened. If we could break educated Indians into two sections holding widely different views, we should, by such a division, strengthen our position against the subtle and continuous attack which the spread of education must make upon our system of government. In other words, if we educate them, they're going to become smarter and they're probably going to toss us out, but not if we educate one to be radical Islamic and another to be something else, and so that they hate each other. Here's another one. This is John Strachey in 1888, a British civil servant. He says, the truth plainly is that the existence side by side of these hostile creeds, that is to say Hindus and Muslims, is one of the strong points in our political position in India. The better clashes of Mohammedans are already a source to us of strength and not of weakness. They constitute a small but energetic minority of the population whose political interests are identical with ours. And then one more I want to read from the British Foreign Department. And this goes to Saudi Arabia. What we want, this is when they were after World War I, when they were looking to take from the Ottomans and carve up the Arab lands. What we want is not a united Arabia, but a weak and disunited Arabia, split up into little principalities so far as possible under our suzerainty, but incapable of coordinated action against us, forming a buffer against the powers in the West. So you see here, divide and conquer, divide and conquer, divide and conquer. Yeah. And in that sense, you start to see, oh, well, okay, so, it's sort of like that Israeli paper on the Islamic State. Yeah, sure, some people are going to get killed here and there. But in a larger imperial purpose, you are going to keep, the actual larger states weak. And in
fact, one of the things you notice, because Curtis is very careful about showing how this evolves through time, is that the same states are targeted over and over for regime change. I mean, the Syrian regime change has been half a century in the making. Libyan regime change was a project for decades before it ever came about. And it can't just be attributed to one administration or even to one country, because it's been the Anglo-American policy for a really long time.
Yeah. And I think, and some of it too has to do with, he gets into this a bit, the Brits, helped the House of Ibn Saud come to power and create this state. But they don't completely control them, and we've talked about this. What is a proxy? Because some people would like to say, well, if so-and-so is like a Russian proxy, it means, the Russians say jump and they say how high. It never works like that. And again, just think of America's relationship with Israel as one example, or our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I mean, who really commands whom in that.
Yeah.
You know, sure, the Saudis could not exist without the British or American, now certainly American muscle, but if they were to go, the entire financial order would. No one wants to see that. They would rather blow up the whole world than see that. You know, that's just not going to happen. And so you know, you empower these people, and then you're in bed with them, and then they have their fucked up, crazy ideas about how things should be run and who their enemies are. And of course, the House of Saud has been violently, insanely, and rationally obsessed with both Iran and Gaddafi. Gaddafi further backs and Iran since 1979. And we have to be in there with them on that, and we have common interests. As that, you know, as that quote, that one of those quotes I said, it's their political interests are identical with ours. That's kind of the key here. I mean, what you find from reading this book over and over from primary sources is they understood that secular Arab nationalists, whether, you know, on the far left or the sort of moderate left, that their interests are not identified with our interests, and that our interests are better served with kind of reactionary feudal regimes that are hierarchical, that are not all about, you know, spreading all the property and wealth around to everybody. They see the world in terms of hierarchy. When you have that sensibility, it's easier for you to also deal with an imperial power backing you outside.